The morning mist hung heavy over the ancient stones of Westminster Abbey as Catherine, Princess of Wales, stood before her bedroom mirror, her hands trembling slightly as she fastened the black pearl necklace that had belonged to Queen Elizabeth. The weight of the jewelry felt different today, heavier somehow, as if it carried the gravity of what was to come. Through the tall windows of their Kensington Palace apartment, she could see the crowds already gathering along the streets of London, their flowers and flags creating a river of color against the gray morning. William emerged from the adjacent room, his naval uniform pressed to perfection, but Catherine could see the exhaustion in his eyes. Neither of them had slept properly in days. The phone calls, the arrangements, the constant stream of officials and family members, it had all blurred into a nightmare from which they couldn't wake. But today was different. Today, they would say goodbye to the woman who had been not just their queen, but William's beloved grandmother. "Are you ready?" William asked softly, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had suddenly become heir to a throne he wasn't quite prepared to inherit. Catherine nodded, though she wasn't sure anyone could truly be ready for what lay ahead. She thought of their children, George, Charlotte, and Louis, who were still too young to fully understand why their great-grandmother would never again slip them sweets during family gatherings or listen patiently to their stories about school. The drive through London was unlike anything Catherine had ever experienced. The streets, usually bustling with the chaos of city life, had transformed into something resembling a cathedral. People lined every inch of the route, many having camped overnight just to catch a glimpse of the funeral procession. Some wept openly, holding photographs of the Queen from decades past. Others stood in respectful silence, their heads bowed as the royal cars passed. Catherine watched through the bulletproof glass as a young mother lifted her toddler onto her shoulders, pointing toward their car. The child waved a small Union Jack, too innocent to understand the solemnity of the moment. It reminded Catherine of her own children's excitement whenever they visited Gone, as they called their great-grandmother. The Queen had always lit up around the little ones, her formal demeanor melting away as she got down on her knees to play with toy cars or help with jigsaw puzzles. At Westminster Abbey, the scene was breathtaking in its magnitude. World leaders who rarely found themselves in the same room sat side by side in the pews. Presidents and prime ministers, kings and queens, all united in their respect for a woman who had reigned for over 70 years. The flowers alone told a story, from simple daisies picked by school children to elaborate wreaths from foreign dignitaries. Each bloom represented a life touched by Queen Elizabeth's steady presence. Catherine took her place beside William in the front pew, acutely aware that billions of eyes around the world were watching their every move. She had been trained for moments like this, had spent years learning the protocols and expectations of royal life, but nothing could have prepared her for the raw emotion of watching her husband grieve so publicly. William sat perfectly upright, his face a mask of composure, but Catherine could see the slight tremor in his hands and knew he was fighting to maintain control. The Archbishop of Canterbury began the service with words that seemed to echo through not just the Abbey, but through history itself. "We are gathered here today to remember and celebrate the life of Elizabeth Alexander Mary Windsor, our Queen, mother, grandmother, and great-grandmother." The simplicity of those words struck Catherine deeply. Beneath all the titles and ceremony, they were mourning a woman who had baked cakes for school fundraisers, who had worried about her children's happiness, who had carried photos of her grandchildren in her handbag. As the service continued, Catherine's mind wandered to the private moments she had shared with the Queen. The afternoon teas where Elizabeth had offered gentle advice about motherhood, always speaking with the wisdom of someone who had raised 4 children under the intense scrutiny of public life. The Christmas mornings when the Queen would personally hand out gifts to each family member, remembering exactly what each child had asked for. The quiet conversations about duty and service, where Elizabeth had shared her own struggles with balancing personal desires against royal obligations. The hymns rose and fell like waves, carrying with them the voices of a nation saying goodbye. "The Lord's my shepherd" had been one of the Queen's favorites, and Catherine could hear William's voice wavering as they sang together. She reached over and gently touched his hand, a small gesture that spoke volumes about their partnership and the strength they drew from each other. When it came time for the readings, Catherine listened to the words from Ecclesiastes about there being a time for everything under heaven. A time to be born and a time to die, a time to weep and a time to laugh. The Queen had lived through all of these times, had been a constant presence through wars and peace, through national celebrations and personal tragedies. She had been there for the births of William and Harry, had guided them through their mother's death, had welcomed Catherine into the family with warmth and acceptance. The moment that nearly broke Catherine's composure came during the Archbishop's eulogy. He spoke of the Queen's unwavering faith, her dedication to service, and her deep love for her family. But it was when he mentioned her sense of humor that Catherine felt tears threaten to spill. She remembered the Queen's mischievous smile when she had surprised them all by appearing in a James Bond sketch for the Olympics, or her delight in photobombing tourists at Windsor Castle when they didn't recognize her. As the service neared its end, Catherine thought about what this day meant for her own family. George, at 9 years old, was now second in line to the throne. Charlotte and Louis would grow up in a world where their great-grandmother existed only in photographs and memories. The weight of continuing Elizabeth's legacy would fall partially on their shoulders, and Catherine felt both proud and protective of her children's future. The final hymn, "God Save the King," marked a moment of profound transition. For the first time in most people's lives, they were singing those words about Charles, William's father, rather than Elizabeth. Catherine could see the emotion on Charles's face as the abbey filled with voices proclaiming him as their sovereign. It was a passing of the torch that had been 70 years in the making. When the service concluded, Catherine and William followed the coffin as it was carried from the abbey. The weight of the Queen's presence seemed to linger in the air, as if her spirit was taking one last look at the institution she had served so faithfully. Outside, the crowds had grown even larger, and the sound of their applause and cheers created a bittersweet symphony that followed the procession through the streets of London. The journey to Windsor Castle felt like a pilgrimage through British history. Every landmark they passed held memories of the Queen's reign. Buckingham Palace, where she had waved from the balcony countless times. The Mall, where millions had gathered to celebrate her jubilees. Hyde Park, where she had ridden her beloved horses. Each location was a chapter in the story of a life lived entirely in service to others. At St. George's Chapel in Windsor, the atmosphere became more intimate. This was where the Queen had worshipped regularly, where she had married Prince Philip, where she had found peace and solitude away from the demands of public life. Catherine felt the weight of history as they entered the chapel where so many royal weddings and funerals had taken place, including her own wedding to William just over a decade earlier. The committal service was shorter, but no less emotional. As the Queen's coffin was lowered into the royal vault, Catherine watched William's face crumble slightly before he caught himself and straightened his shoulders. She knew that in that moment, he wasn't just saying goodbye to his grandmother, but to the last link to his childhood, to the woman who had been a constant source of wisdom and love throughout his life. The day had been a masterclass in British pageantry and tradition, but for Catherine, it had been something much more personal. It had been a farewell to a woman who had welcomed her into an extraordinary family, who had guided her through the challenges of royal life, and who had shown her what it meant to put duty before personal desires. As they returned to Kensington Palace that evening, Catherine knew that the real work of honoring Elizabeth's memory was just beginning. The days following the funeral passed in a strange blur of silence and overwhelming responsibility. Catherine found herself waking each morning with the momentary confusion of someone emerging from a vivid dream, only to remember that the dream was actually their new reality. The Queen was gone, Charles was now king, and William had become the Prince of Wales overnight. Their lives had shifted on their axis, and Catherine was struggling to find her footing in this new world. The children had returned to school, but the teachers reported that George seemed distant and distracted. He had asked his headmaster when his great-grandmother would be coming back from heaven for tea, and the innocent question had left the staff unsure how to respond. Charlotte had become unusually clingy, refusing to let Catherine out of her sight, while Louis continued his usual cheerful routine, too young to fully grasp the permanent nature of death. Catherine stood in the nursery at Kensington Palace, folding tiny clothes that seemed to grow smaller with each passing day. The room was filled with afternoon sunlight, casting long shadows across the floor where the children played with their wooden toys. Through the window, she could see the memorial flowers that still lined the palace gates, though the crowds had thinned considerably since the funeral. The flowers were beginning to wilt now, their bright colors fading to brown around the edges. But new bouquets appeared daily as people continued to pay their respects. William had thrown himself into his new duties with the intensity of a man trying to outrun his grief. He spent long hours in meetings with palace officials, learning the intricate details of his expanded role as heir apparent. Catherine watched him leave each morning with his briefcase full of red boxes and state papers, and she could see the weight settling on his shoulders like a heavy coat he couldn't remove. He was becoming more like his grandmother every day, duty first, personal feelings second. The phone rang constantly now. Invitations to state dinners, requests for patronages, schedules for upcoming tours. Catherine's private secretary, a kind woman named Sarah who had worked for the royal family for over 20 years, tried to shield her from the most overwhelming aspects of their new status. But there was no escaping the fact that their lives had fundamentally changed. They were no longer just the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge. They were the future King and Queen of England. One particularly difficult morning, Catherine received a call from a children's hospital in Birmingham. They wanted to know if she would consider taking over one of the Queen's patronages, a charity that provided support for families with seriously ill children. The request should have been straightforward, but Catherine found herself overcome with emotion as she remembered the Queen's last visit to the hospital just months before her death. Elizabeth had spent nearly 4 hours there, personally meeting with every family, her stamina remarkable for a woman in her 90s. The children still ask about her, the hospital director explained over the phone. They drew pictures for her, you see, and we haven't had the heart to tell them she won't be coming back to collect them. Catherine promised to visit soon, knowing that she would have to find her own way to fill the enormous shoes the Queen had left behind. That afternoon, William returned home earlier than usual, finding Catherine in their private sitting room reading briefing papers about early childhood development. He looked exhausted, his usual composed demeanor showing cracks around the edges. Without saying a word, he sat beside her on the sofa and laid his head on her shoulder, a gesture so vulnerable it made Catherine's heart ache. "The Prime Minister wants us to do a tour of the Commonwealth realms," he said quietly. "Australia, New Zealand, Canada. Father thinks it's important to maintain the relationships grandmother built." Catherine set down her papers and ran her fingers through his hair, a simple comfort she had offered countless times over their years together. "When?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Next month, right after the official mourning period ends." William sat up and looked at her, his blue eyes reflecting the same exhaustion she felt in her bones. "I know it's soon, but the advisors think it's necessary. A show of continuity and stability." Catherine nodded, understanding the logic even as her heart rebelled against the idea of leaving their children so soon after such a traumatic event. George was already struggling with the changes in their family. How would he cope with his parents traveling to the other side of the world? But she also understood the weight of expectation that came with their positions. The Queen had never used personal grief as an excuse to avoid her duties, and neither could they. The evening news that night featured a segment about the economic impact of the Queen's death. Tourism to royal sites had actually increased in the weeks since the funeral, with people from around the world coming to pay their respects. The reporter interviewed a family from Japan who had traveled specifically to leave flowers at Buckingham Palace, their young daughter clutching a hand-drawn picture of the Queen surrounded by her famous corgis. Catherine turned off the television, unable to watch any more coverage of their loss being analyzed and quantified by strangers. She found William in George's bedroom, reading their son a story about a brave little prince who had to learn to be king. George's questions were getting more complex each night. Why couldn't great-granny stay and be queen forever? Why did grandpapa have to be king if it made everyone sad? Would daddy have to leave them too when it was his turn? William answered each question with patience and honesty, but Catherine could see the toll it was taking on him. He was grieving his grandmother while simultaneously preparing for a role he had never wanted but had always known would be his. The contradiction was tearing him apart, and Catherine felt helpless to fix the unfixable nature of their situation. After the children were asleep, Catherine and William walked through the private gardens of Kensington Palace. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and the distant sounds of London traffic. They had taken this same walk countless times over the years, but tonight it felt different. Everything felt different now. "Do you remember what she said to us at our wedding reception?" William asked, stopping beside the rose garden that had been one of Diana's favorite spots. Catherine smiled, recalling the Queen's words that had seemed so formal at the time, but now felt prophetic. She said that marriage was a partnership, and that the royal family needed partners who understood that duty and love weren't opposites. They were the same thing. Catherine linked her arm through William's, feeling the truth of those words more deeply now than she had 11 years ago. "I used to think she was just being diplomatic," William admitted. "But she was right, wasn't she? About everything." His voice broke slightly on the last word, and Catherine felt her own tears threatening to spill over. They had both been so young when they married, so focused on their love for each other that they hadn't fully grasped the magnitude of what they were signing up for. The next morning brought news that would test their resolve in ways they hadn't anticipated. The Archbishop of Canterbury requested a private meeting to discuss the children's religious education. With William now heir apparent, George's path to the throne was more concrete than ever, and the Church of England wanted to ensure he received proper instruction in his future role as Supreme Governor of the Church. Catherine felt her maternal instincts flare at the suggestion. George was still a little boy who collected dinosaur figures and worried about monsters under his bed. The idea of burdening him with the weight of religious leadership seemed cruel and premature. But she also knew that the Queen had begun similar instruction at an even younger age, and it had served her well throughout her reign. The meeting with the Archbishop was held in the Blue Drawing Room at Kensington Palace, a formal space that Catherine had always found intimidating. The Archbishop, a gentle man in his 60s with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, seemed to understand her concerns before she voiced them. "Your Majesty," he began, then caught himself. "I apologize, Your Royal Highness. I'm still adjusting to the new forms of address." The small mistake humanized him in Catherine's eyes, reminding her that everyone was struggling to adapt to their changed circumstances. "We want George to have a normal childhood," Catherine said firmly. "As normal as possible under the circumstances." William nodded in agreement, though she could see him wrestling with the competing demands of protecting their son and preparing him for his destiny. The Archbishop smiled warmly. "Of course, but perhaps we might consider it not as an additional burden, but as giving him tools to understand his heritage and his future responsibilities." The Queen often spoke of how her faith sustained her through difficult times. "We would simply be offering young Prince George the same foundation." As they discussed the details of George's religious instruction, Catherine found herself thinking about the Queen's own childhood. Elizabeth had been thrust into her role as heir when her uncle abdicated, transforming her from a spare into the future monarch overnight. Yet she had navigated that transition with grace and determination, eventually becoming one of the most respected rulers in British history. That evening, Catherine sat in the nursery with Charlotte and Louis, helping them with a puzzle that depicted scenes from British history. Charlotte carefully placed a piece showing a knight in armor, while Louis giggled as he tried to fit a piece of castle wall into a spot clearly meant for sky. The simple domesticity of the moment felt precious and fragile, a reminder of what they were fighting to protect. "Mummy," Charlotte said suddenly, "will I have to be queen someday if something happens to George?" The question caught Catherine off guard with its perceptive innocence. At 7, Charlotte was already beginning to understand the complexities of their family's position in a way that broke Catherine's heart. "That's not something you need to worry about, darling," Catherine replied, smoothing Charlotte's hair. "George is going to be a wonderful king when he's much, much older, and you'll get to choose your own path in life." But even as she said the words, Catherine knew they weren't entirely true. None of them really got to choose their own paths. They were born into roles that came with predetermined scripts and expectations. Later that night, after the children were asleep and the palace staff had retreated to their quarters, Catherine found herself in the Queen's former study. Charles had officially moved his belongings to Buckingham Palace, but this room remained largely unchanged from Elizabeth's time. The desk still held her favorite fountain pen, the one she had used to sign countless documents over the decades. The walls were lined with photographs spanning 7 decades of reign, from a young princess holding her first corgi to recent pictures with her great-grandchildren. Catherine picked up a small silver frame that contained a photo of the Queen with William and Harry as young boys. Elizabeth was kneeling in a garden, her face alight with joy as she helped the princes plant seeds in small pots. It was such an ordinary moment, the kind that happened in families everywhere. Yet it spoke to the duality that had defined the Queen's life, the ability to be both a sovereign and a grandmother, formal and loving, dutiful and human. As Catherine prepared to leave the study, she noticed a leather-bound journal lying open on a side table. The Queen's handwriting filled the page in neat, careful script. Catherine knew she shouldn't read it, but her eyes caught a few words that made her pause. "The children bring such light to these old rooms. William has grown into such a fine man, and Catherine has brought him the kind of happiness I always hoped he would find. They will face challenges I cannot imagine, but they have each other, and that makes all the difference." Catherine closed the journal with tears in her eyes, feeling as though she had received a final blessing from the woman who had shaped their lives in ways both public and private. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new responsibilities, but tonight, in the quiet of the palace with her family sleeping peacefully nearby, Catherine felt ready to face whatever came next. The Queen's legacy lived on not just in the institution she had served so faithfully, but in the love and wisdom she had passed down to those who would carry it forward. The morning of their departure for the Commonwealth tour arrived with unexpected autumn sunshine streaming through the windows of Kensington Palace. Catherine stood in the children's playroom, watching as George carefully arranged his collection of miniature soldiers on the windowsill. He had been unusually quiet since learning that his parents would be away for 2 weeks, and Catherine's heart ached at the sight of his small shoulders hunched over his toys. "Will you bring me back a kangaroo?" Louis asked from his position on the floor, where he was attempting to build a tower with wooden blocks. His 3-year-old mind couldn't quite grasp the concept of countries being too far away to simply pop back for dinner, and Catherine found his innocent questions both heartbreaking and endearing. Charlotte sat curled in the reading corner with a book about Australian wildlife, determined to learn everything she could about the places her parents would visit. At 7, she was old enough to understand that this trip was different from their usual holidays, that it carried weight and importance beyond simple vacation. Her questions over breakfast had been surprisingly sophisticated. Will the people there be sad about Great-Granny too? Do they want Daddy to be their king someday? William appeared in the doorway, adjusting his tie with a nervous energy that had become increasingly common since the Queen's death. He looked every inch the future king in his perfectly tailored navy suit, but Catherine could see the reluctance in his eyes. Neither of them wanted to leave the children so soon after losing Elizabeth, but the Commonwealth realms were expecting them, needing reassurance that the bonds their great-grandmother had spent decades nurturing would continue under the new reign. "The car will be here in 20 minutes," William said softly, then knelt down to join Louis on the floor. "Remember what we talked about, little man? Nanny Maria will take you to the park every day, and Granny Carol will come for tea on Thursday." Their interactions with the children had taken on a heightened intensity since the Queen's death, as if they were all more aware of how precious and fragile their time together truly was. The drive to Heathrow Airport was eerily quiet, both Catherine and William lost in their own thoughts. The streets of London looked different somehow, as if the city itself was still adjusting to the post-Elizabeth era. Union Jacks flew at half-mast from government buildings, and Catherine noticed that many shop windows still displayed photographs of the late Queen alongside messages of condolence. At the airport, they were greeted by a small crowd of officials and media representatives. The press had been particularly intense since the Queen's death, analyzing every aspect of William and Catherine's new roles, speculating about how they would handle the increased responsibilities. Catherine had learned to smile and wave even when she felt overwhelmed, drawing on lessons the Queen had taught her about the importance of maintaining composure in public. The flight to Sydney was long and subdued. Catherine spent much of the time reviewing briefing papers about their upcoming engagements, trying to absorb the complex political and cultural nuances of each country they would visit. William worked on his speech for the Australian Parliament, his handwriting becoming more cramped as he crossed out and rewrote sections. They were both acutely aware that this tour would be seen as their first major test as the new Prince and Princess of Wales. When they landed in Sydney, the Australian sunshine felt like a warm embrace after the grey skies of London. The crowds at the airport were enormous, with people holding signs reading "Welcome to Australia" and "We love Will and Kate." Many also carried photographs of Queen Elizabeth, their faces reflecting the same grief and uncertainty that Catherine had seen on the streets of London. Their first official engagement was a reception with Australian government officials and Commonwealth representatives. Catherine had chosen to wear a dress in deep blue, a color that she knew photographed well, but also felt appropriately somber for their ongoing period of mourning. As they moved through the receiving line, shaking hands and making small talk, she could see how carefully everyone was watching them, looking for signs of how they would carry forward the Queen's legacy. The Governor-General of Australia, a dignified woman in her 70s who had worked closely with Queen Elizabeth for decades, pulled Catherine aside during the reception. "Her Majesty spoke of you often," she said quietly. "She was so proud of how you had adapted to royal life, how naturally you took to the role. She said you had the same instinctive understanding of service that had guided her throughout her reign." Catherine felt tears prick her eyes at these unexpected words. The Queen had rarely expressed such personal sentiments directly, preferring to show her approval through small gestures and increased responsibilities. To learn that Elizabeth had been proud of her felt like receiving a final gift from beyond the grave. Their schedule in Australia was packed with engagements designed to showcase the continuing strength of the Commonwealth relationship. They visited a children's hospital in Sydney, where Catherine met with families who were dealing with challenges remarkably similar to those she had encountered at hospitals in Britain. The universal nature of parental love and worry transcended national boundaries, and Catherine found herself deeply moved by the courage of the children and their families. At one point during the hospital visit, a young boy with leukemia asked Catherine if she missed the Queen. The question, delivered with the directness that only children possess, caught her off guard. "Yes," she replied honestly, kneeling down to his level. "We all miss her very much. But she taught us that even when we're sad, we have to keep helping other people." The boy nodded solemnly, as if this made perfect sense to him, and Catherine realized that children often understood grief better than adults gave them credit for. William's speech to the Australian Parliament was perhaps the most challenging moment of the tour. Standing at the same podium where the Queen had addressed the nation's leaders numerous times over the decades, He spoke about the continuity of the Commonwealth relationship and his commitment to honoring his grandmother's legacy. Catherine watched from the gallery, her heart racing as she saw him struggle to maintain his composure when speaking about Elizabeth's dedication to Australia. "My grandmother once said that the Commonwealth is not just an institution, it is a family," William told the assembled politicians. "Today, that family is grieving together, but we are also looking forward together, united in our shared values and our commitment to serving the people of our nations." The applause that followed was thunderous, but Catherine could see tears in the eyes of many in the audience, including some who were old enough to remember the Queen's first visit to Australia as a young princess. Their private moments during the tour were precious and rare. Late at night, in their hotel suite in Canberra, Catherine and William would call home to speak with the children, their voices brightening perceptibly as they heard about George's football practice and Charlotte's piano lessons. The time difference made these calls logistically challenging, but they were essential for maintaining their connection to the family they had temporarily left behind. One evening, as they prepared for bed after a particularly long day of engagements, William sat on the edge of the hotel bed with his head in his hands. "I don't know if I'm doing this right," he admitted quietly. "Everything grandmother made look effortless feels impossible to me." Catherine sat beside him, placing a comforting hand on his back. "She didn't learn how to do this overnight," Catherine reminded him. "She had 70 years of practice, and even she made mistakes along the way. The difference is that you have something she didn't have when she started. You have a choice. You can learn from her example while still finding your own way of serving." The tour's most emotional moment came during their visit to New Zealand, when they attended a memorial service for Queen Elizabeth at the cathedral in Wellington. The service was attended by hundreds of people, many of whom had met the Queen during her numerous visits to New Zealand over the decades. Catherine was struck by the personal nature of many of the tributes. Stories of the Queen stopping to pet someone's dog during a walkabout, or remembering a child's name from a previous visit years earlier. An elderly Maori woman approached Catherine after the service, her weathered hands gently taking Catherine's in hers. "She was our queen too," the woman said simply. She understood that being queen wasn't about being above people, it was about being among them. The woman's words resonated deeply with Catherine, who had always struggled with the hierarchical aspects of royal life, but had found meaning in the service components of her role. During their final days in Canada, Catherine and William visited a residential school memorial, a sobering reminder of the complex history between Indigenous peoples and the Crown. It was a difficult and necessary engagement, one that required them to acknowledge past wrongs while committing to a different future. Catherine was impressed by William's handling of the sensitive conversations, his willingness to listen and learn rather than simply offer platitudes. The Canadian Prime Minister hosted a farewell dinner on their last night, and Catherine found herself seated next to a historian who had written extensively about the Queen's relationship with the Commonwealth. "Your Royal Highness," the woman said, "I hope you don't mind me saying, but I think Her late Majesty would be very proud of how you and the Prince have handled this tour. You've managed to honor her memory, while also bringing your own personalities to the role." As their plane lifted off from Ottawa, beginning the long journey back to London, Catherine felt a mixture of exhaustion and accomplishment. The tour had been challenging in ways she hadn't anticipated, but it had also been deeply meaningful. They had seen firsthand how much the Queen had meant to people around the world, but they had also begun to understand how they might serve those same communities in their own way. William reached for her hand as they settled into their seats for the overnight flight. "Thank you," he said simply. Catherine squeezed his hand in return, understanding without words what he was thanking her for. They had gotten through their first major test as the new Prince and Princess of Wales, and they had done it together. Looking out the airplane window at the lights of Canada disappearing below them, Catherine thought about the children waiting for them at home and the life they were building together in the shadow of an extraordinary legacy. The Queen's death had changed everything, but it had also strengthened their understanding of what really mattered, their commitment to each other, to their children, and to the people they served. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new responsibilities, but tonight, 30,000 feet above the Atlantic Ocean, Catherine felt ready for whatever lay ahead. The tour had taught them that they could carry forward the Queen's legacy while still being true to themselves, and that realization felt like a gift Elizabeth had given them from beyond the grave. The reunion with their children at Kensington Palace was more emotional than Catherine had anticipated. George flew into William's arms with such force that he nearly knocked his father over, while Charlotte clung to Catherine's dress with tears streaming down her face. Even Louis, usually the most independent of the three, insisted on being carried everywhere for the rest of the evening. The 2 weeks apart had felt like an eternity to the children, and Catherine realized that their absence had affected the little ones more deeply than anyone had expected. That night, after the children had finally settled into their beds, Catherine found herself walking through the palace corridors, reacquainting herself with the familiar spaces that somehow felt different after their time away. The portraits of previous royals seemed to watch her with new interest, as if assessing whether she and William were worthy successors to the legacy they represented. The weight of history felt heavier now, more personal and immediate than it had before their Commonwealth tour. William joined her in the blue drawing room, carrying 2 cups of tea and wearing the comfortable clothes he had changed into as soon as they arrived home. He looked younger somehow, freed from the formal requirements of their public appearances, but Catherine could see new lines around his eyes and a weariness that hadn't been there before the Queen's death. The children seemed different, he observed, settling beside her on the silk sofa that had been a wedding gift from his grandmother. More aware somehow. George asked me during bedtime if we were going to die soon too. The pain in William's voice was evident, and Catherine felt her own heart clench at the thought of their eldest son grappling with mortality at such a young age. Dr. Peterson thinks it's normal, Catherine replied, referring to the child psychologist they had quietly consulted about helping the children process their great-grandmother's death. Children often become more conscious of death after losing someone close to them. We just need to be patient and honest with them. But even as she spoke the words, Catherine wondered how honest they could really be about the risks and pressures that came with their royal roles. The next morning brought a return to the relentless schedule that had become their new normal. Catherine's first engagement was a visit to a women's shelter in East London, one of the Queen's former patronages that she was gradually taking over. The drive through London's diverse neighborhoods reminded her of how much the city had changed during Elizabeth's reign, evolving from a war-damaged capital into a vibrant, multicultural metropolis. At the shelter, Catherine met with women who were rebuilding their lives after escaping domestic violence. Their stories were heartbreaking, but also inspiring, filled with courage and determination that reminded Catherine of the Queen's own resilience during difficult times. One woman, a mother of 2 young children, spoke about how meeting the Queen at a similar event years earlier had given her hope during her darkest period. She didn't just shake my hand and move on, the woman explained to Catherine as they sat in the shelter's small garden. She asked about my children, remembered their names when she came back the next year. It made me feel like I mattered, like my life had value even when I felt worthless. Catherine listened with growing admiration for Elizabeth's ability to make personal connections with people from all walks of life, a skill she was still developing herself. During the lunch break, Catherine received a call from her private secretary with news that would test their family's ability to balance public duty with private grief. The palace had received a request from the BBC to participate in a documentary about the Queen's life, featuring interviews with family members sharing personal memories. The project would be broadcast on the first anniversary of Elizabeth's death, and the producers were hoping for intimate, never-before-heard stories from those who knew her best. Catherine felt torn about the request. Part of her wanted to share the warm, funny, deeply human side of the Queen that the public rarely saw. But another part of her recoiled at the thought of turning their grief into entertainment, of having their most precious memories scrutinized and analyzed by strangers. She promised to discuss it with William and get back to them within a week. That evening, as they helped the children with their homework around the kitchen table at Kensington Palace, Catherine broached the subject of the documentary. William's initial reaction was skeptical, but George's unexpected contribution to the conversation changed the dynamic entirely. "Will it help people remember how nice Great-Granny was?" George asked, looking up from his mathematics worksheet with serious eyes. "Because some of my friends at school don't know that she was funny and liked to play games." His innocent question cut through their adult complications and helped them see the documentary request in a different light. William and Catherine spent the next several days discussing the pros and cons of participating. They consulted with Charles, who was surprisingly supportive of the idea, believing that sharing personal stories would help humanize the monarchy for a new generation. Harry, reached by video call from California, was more hesitant but agreed to consider participating if his brother felt it was the right thing to do. The decision was made easier by a letter they received from one of the Queen's former ladies-in-waiting. Lady Susan had served Elizabeth for over 40 years and had witnessed countless private moments that revealed the Queen's character. Her letter described the documentary as an opportunity to show the world the woman behind the crown, the grandmother and great-grandmother who had shaped their lives in ways both profound and subtle. When they finally agreed to participate, Catherine found herself looking forward to the interview process. She began making notes about her favorite memories of the Queen, stories that revealed Elizabeth's wit, wisdom, and unexpected mischievousness. There was the time the Queen had surprised them all by learning to use FaceTime to video call the children when they were traveling. Or the afternoon when she had insisted on helping Catherine plant vegetables in the palace garden, getting soil under her perfectly manicured nails without complaint. The filming took place on a crisp December morning in the white drawing room at Kensington Palace. Catherine had chosen to wear a navy blue dress that had been one of the Queen's favorite colors, and she carried the pearl earrings Elizabeth had given her for her wedding. The documentary crew was small and respectful, understanding the sensitive nature of their subjects. William spoke first, sharing memories of his grandmother's guidance during difficult times and her unwavering support for his relationship with Catherine. His voice was steady, but emotional as he described Elizabeth's reaction to Diana's death and her help in shielding him and Harry from the worst aspects of the media attention that followed. When it was Catherine's turn to speak, she found herself thinking not about the cameras or the millions of people who would eventually watch, but about the woman they were honoring. She spoke about the Queen's practical advice on everything from potty training to state dinners, her ability to make everyone feel welcomed at family gatherings, and her genuine delight in her great-grandchildren's accomplishments. "She had this way of making you feel like you were the only person in the room," Catherine told the interviewer. Even at state banquets with hundreds of guests, she would find a moment to ask about the children or remember something we had discussed weeks earlier. "She taught me that being royal isn't about being remote or untouchable. It's about connecting with people and making them feel valued." The most emotional moment of the interview came when Catherine was asked about the Queen's final words to her. They had spoken by phone just days before Elizabeth's death, a conversation that had seemed routine at the time, but had taken on profound meaning in retrospect. "She told me to take care of William," Catherine said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not the future king, not the Prince of Wales, but William. She said that everything else would follow if I remembered that first." The simplicity of the advice was quintessentially Elizabeth, profound wisdom disguised as common sense. After the filming was complete, Catherine and William took a long walk through Hyde Park, needing fresh air and space to process the emotions the interview had stirred up. The park was busy with Christmas shoppers and families enjoying the winter sunshine, a reminder that life continued to move forward even in the midst of their grief. "Do you think we did the right thing?" William asked as they paused beside the Serpentine, watching ducks glide across the dark water. Catherine considered the question carefully, thinking about the stories they had shared and the image of the Queen they had presented to the world. "I think she would have been horrified by the idea initially," Catherine replied with a small smile. But then she would have seen it as another form of service, another way to help people understand what the monarchy means. She was always practical about using her position to serve a greater purpose. As Christmas approached, Catherine found herself thinking more about how to help their children honor the Queen's memory while also creating their own family traditions. They decided to establish a new Christmas Eve tradition of sharing favorite memories of Elizabeth, allowing the children to ask questions and share their own recollections of their great-grandmother. On Christmas morning, as they watched George, Charlotte, and Louis tear through their presents with typical childhood enthusiasm, Catherine felt a bittersweet sense of continuity. The Queen's absence was keenly felt, especially during the traditional Christmas Day church service at Sandringham, but her influence remained strong in the values and traditions she had passed down to her family. The year ended quietly, with Catherine and William reflecting on how much their lives had changed in just a few months. The Commonwealth tour had been successful, the documentary had been well received, and their children were beginning to adapt to their new reality. But perhaps most importantly, they had begun to find their own way of honoring the Queen's legacy while staying true to their own values and priorities. On New Year's Eve, as they watched fireworks light up the London sky from the windows of Kensington Palace, Catherine felt a sense of hope for the year ahead. The grief would always be with them, and the weight of their responsibilities would only grow heavier with time. But they had each other and the strong foundation Elizabeth had helped them build. She would have been proud, William said softly, echoing Catherine's own thoughts, as they welcomed the new year together, surrounded by their sleeping children and sustained by their love for each other. Catherine knew that the Queen's greatest legacy wasn't the crown or the palaces or the ceremonies. It was the understanding that true nobility came from serving others with humility, grace, and unwavering commitment. The mourning period was officially over, but the real work of carrying forward Elizabeth's example was just beginning. Catherine felt ready for the challenge, knowing that she carried with her not just the Queen's expectations, but her love, her wisdom, and her unshakable belief in the power of service to transform both those who give and those who receive it.